A body slammed into the desert dirt with a sound that made everyone stop breathing. Cameras kept rolling for exactly 4 seconds before someone finally yelled, "Cut!" Dean Martin was 20 feet away, covered in fake blood from the fight scene they'd been filming, and when he saw the twisted shape lying motionless outside that saloon window, something fundamental shifted inside him. What happened in the next hour wouldn't just halt one of Hollywood's most expensive westerns. It would force an entire industry to confront how little it valued human life, and John Wayne, the toughest man in pictures, would later say he'd witnessed the most courageous act he'd ever seen in 40 years of making movies. This was Arizona, in the summer of 1958. Old Tucson studios, where the mercury was climbing past 112 degrees, and the only relief was the expensive air conditioning in the trailers reserved for the stars. They were deep into Rio Bravo, a film that would eventually be recognized as one of the finest westerns ever crafted. But July 23rd wasn't about making cinema history. It was about discovering what happens when profit collides with conscience, and which one wins when a man's life hangs in the balance. Hollywood in the late 50s operated on a simple principle: human beings were expendable, not the stars, obviously, not the directors with their guaranteed percentages, but everyone else, the people who built the sets, who fell off horses, who took punches for the camera. They were just parts in a machine. Break a part, replace it, keep the assembly line moving. Insurance was minimal. Safety protocols were suggestions at best, and if you got injured doing what the production asked you to do, well, that was the risk you accepted when you signed your name on that liability waiver. Dean Martin had watched this system devour people for his entire career. He'd been around show business long enough to see the wreckage it created, but Dean was a singer who'd transitioned into acting, a crooner who'd gotten lucky with some comedies, and was now proving he could handle dramatic roles. His job was simple: memorize the lines, look good in the costume, don't create problems. That's what kept you employed in Hollywood. You showed up, did what they asked, took your money, and went home. The machine kept grinding, and you either learned to work within it or you got crushed by it. But there was something different brewing on the Rio Bravo set. Maybe it was the intensity of working alongside John Wayne, a man whose presence demanded a certain standard. Maybe it was the isolation of shooting in the Arizona desert, where the normal Hollywood buffers and distractions fell away. Or maybe Dean Martin had simply reached that point in life where staying silent becomes more painful than speaking up. Whatever the reason, July 23rd would reveal a side of Dean Martin that most people, including Dean himself, didn't know existed. They were shooting a massive saloon brawl, classic Western choreography, bodies crashing through furniture, fists connecting with jaws, the carefully orchestrated chaos that looked spontaneous on screen. The production had hired roughly 30 stunt performers and background players, most of them locals from Tucson, pulling down $75 for a day's work. Good wages in 1958, assuming you lived to spend them. Among those extras was a 34-year-old named Tommy Mitchell. Tommy had rodeo experience. He'd spent years getting thrown from broncos and bulls and had transitioned into stunt work about 5 years earlier. He had a wife named Sarah and 2 young daughters back home. Getting hired onto Rio Bravo felt like a breakthrough. Working with John Wayne and Dean Martin meant the kind of credit that could elevate a stuntman's career to the next level. Tommy's assignment that afternoon seemed straightforward. During the brawl sequence, 2 other stuntmen would grab him and hurl him through a breakaway window. He'd crash through the sugar glass, the fake stuff designed to shatter safely, hit the dirt outside, execute 2 rolls, and lie still. Simple stunt work, the kind of thing Tommy had done countless times. The sugar glass would break on impact, the window frame would give way, and he'd land in the dirt with nothing worse than some bruises. But someone in the props department had made a catastrophic error that morning. The window frame they'd installed wasn't the breakaway version made of balsa wood. It was a reinforced frame built with metal supports to withstand the desert wind. It looked identical to the correct frame. Nobody noticed the switch. Nobody checked. The assistant director called for action. The saloon exploded into motion, chairs splintering, bodies colliding, perfectly choreographed mayhem. Right on cue, 2 stuntmen seized Tommy Mitchell and launched him toward the window. He hit it at full velocity. The sugar glass shattered exactly as designed, a perfect explosion of fake crystal. But the frame didn't break. Instead of disintegrating and allowing Tommy to sail through cleanly, that metal-reinforced frame caught him mid-flight like a steel cable across his chest. The sound was horrible. Not the theatrical crack of breaking props, but something wet and organic that carried across the desert silence. Tommy's body contorted unnaturally in midair before dropping 12 feet straight down onto packed earth that was hard as concrete from the desert heat. He didn't roll, he didn't move, he just lay there while dust settled around him like a burial shroud. Someone finally screamed for them to cut. For maybe 3 heartbeats, the entire set existed in suspended animation. Then chaos erupted. The stunt coordinator sprinted across the set. The on-site medic grabbed his kit and ran. Crew members converged from every direction, and Dean Martin, still in full costume with stage blood streaked across his shirt, pushed through the gathering crowd. Tommy Mitchell was conscious, technically. His eyes were open, but his left arm was bent in a configuration that defied anatomy. Blood was streaming from a laceration on his scalp, and worst of all, his legs weren't moving, not at all. The medic took one look and said the words that made everyone's stomach drop. They needed an ambulance immediately. This was serious. This was potentially catastrophic. That's when Gerald Foster materialized. Foster was the production manager, the studio's representative, the man whose job was keeping Rio Bravo on schedule and under budget. He surveyed Tommy Mitchell lying broken in the dirt, and what he said next would become the spark that ignited everything that followed. Get him off my set. Put him in somebody's vehicle and drive him to the hospital, and find out who installed the wrong window frame. They're terminated. That was it. No concern about whether Tommy would survive. No questions about the severity of his injuries. Just get him off the set like he was defective equipment cluttering the workspace. The medic immediately protested, explaining that Tommy shouldn't be moved until paramedics arrived with proper equipment. Foster cut him off mid-sentence. They were losing daylight. Every minute of production delay cost the studio $10,000. Remove him from the set and reset for another take. Dean Martin heard every word. He was standing close enough to see Foster's expression, that cold calculation that weighed human suffering against production schedules and decided suffering was the acceptable cost. And something inside Dean Martin, something that had been quietly accumulating pressure for years, finally fractured. He walked toward Foster, not rushed, not aggressive, just deliberately. His voice when he spoke was quiet, almost conversational, which somehow made it more unsettling. What hospital are you sending him to? Foster barely glanced at him. Tucson General, presumably. Why? Who's covering his medical expenses? Foster finally looked at Dean properly. That's not the studio's concern. He signed a liability waiver. These people understand the risks. It's part of the profession. Dean took a slow breath. So Warner Brothers isn't paying for his treatment. The studio provides on-set medical response. Anything beyond that scope is his personal responsibility. That's industry standard. Now, if you'll excuse me, we need to reset this sequence. Dean Martin's next words came out measured and final. Reset it. Without me. Foster's face flushed crimson. I'm sorry, what? You heard correctly. I'm not filming another second until that man's medical bills are covered. All of them. The entire set went silent. Crew members froze mid-motion. John Wayne, who'd been in his trailer reviewing tomorrow's scenes, emerged and stood at the periphery, watching. Howard Hawks, the director, lowered his script. Everyone sensed they were witnessing something unprecedented. Foster attempted a laugh, but it came out strangled. Dean, don't be theatrical. The man signed a waiver. This is standard procedure. Not anymore. Foster's smile evaporated. You have a contract. You can't simply refuse to work. Dean removed his costume hat and handed it to a nearby assistant. Watch me. Foster moved closer, dropping his voice to a threatening whisper. You walk off this production, and you'll never work in this industry again. Do you comprehend what I'm telling you? Warner Brothers will obliterate your ear. You'll be finished. Dean didn't flinch. Then I'm finished. But that man's not going to lose everything he owns because your crew made a mistake. The silence that followed was absolute. In 1958, actors didn't challenge studios this way. Studios held absolute power. They could destroy careers with a phone call, blacklist performers permanently. ensure you never saw the inside of a soundstage again. Dean Martin understood this. Everyone understood this. But Dean was holding his ground anyway. Foster played what he thought was his winning card. You're stopping a production that employs 150 people. Every day we're not shooting is a day they're not earning wages. You want that responsibility. Dean looked around at the crew surrounding them. Electricians, camera operators, makeup artists, sound technicians, all of them watching to see what would happen next. And then Dean said something that changed everything. How many of you have been injured on a set and had to pay your own medical costs? For a moment, nobody reacted. Then slowly, deliberately, hands began rising. 1 hand, 3 hands, a dozen. More than half the crew raised their hands. Broken bones from equipment failures, concussions from falling lights, burns from malfunctioning pyrotechnics. Every one of them had been told it wasn't the studio's problem. Dean turned back to Foster. So it's not just Tommy, it's all of them. Everyone on this set who's been damaged and discarded. You're telling me that's just the system? Foster's jaw clenched. This is a business, Martin, not a charity. Then let me clarify the situation. Either Warner Brothers pays every cent of Tommy Mitchell's medical expenses, surgery, rehabilitation, everything, or I walk, and I take this story with me. I'll tell every journalist in Los Angeles exactly why Rio Bravo shut down, how a man was crippled because your crew used the wrong equipment and the studio refused to help him. The threat hung in the scorching desert air like smoke. In 1958, Hollywood studios controlled narratives, they controlled the press, but Dean Martin threatening to speak to reporters, that was genuine power, that was dangerous, that could metastasize into the kind of scandal that would cost millions in damaged reputation. Foster's face went from crimson to purple. You don't have that kind of leverage. That's when John Wayne stepped forward. The Duke had been observing the entire confrontation in silence. Now he walked directly up to Foster and stood beside Dean without saying a single word. The message was unmistakable. Whatever Dean does, I'm doing it too. Howard Hawks, the director, joined them. Then the cinematographer. Then the stunt coordinator. One by one, key personnel from the production walked over and stood with Dean Martin, creating a silent wall of solidarity. Foster looked around at the faces staring back at him. He was outnumbered, outmaneuvered. If Dean walked, the film was dead. If John Wayne walked with him, Warner Brothers would lose their entire investment. And if this became a public scandal about how the studio treated injured workers, the damage would be catastrophic. Foster pulled out a handkerchief and wiped his face. I need to make a phone call. He disappeared into the production office trailer. Dean Martin remained motionless, arms crossed, waiting. The crew didn't reset anything. Nobody moved. The entire production was frozen, thousands of dollars evaporating with each passing minute, but nobody cared. Something more important than money was happening. 20 minutes later, Foster emerged. His expression was carefully controlled. Warner Brothers will cover Mr. Mitchell's medical expenses, all of them, and we'll be reviewing our insurance policies for the entire crew. Dean didn't smile, didn't celebrate, just nodded once. I want that documented in writing today. You'll have it before business hours end. And I want an update on Tommy's condition before we resume filming. Foster hesitated, then nodded. Agreed. Dean turned to address the crew. Anyone here want to continue working under the old conditions? Speak up now, because if we're doing this, we're doing it properly. Nobody else gets hurt and abandoned. Nobody spoke. The answer was written on every face. Howard Hawks cleared his throat. All right then. Let's take the remainder of today. Give everyone a chance to decompress. We'll resume tomorrow morning. As people began dispersing, John Wayne pulled Dean aside. That was the gutsiest thing I've witnessed in my life. You understand you just painted a target on yourself, right? The studios will remember this. Dean shrugged. Let them remember. Wayne studied him for a long moment, then extended his hand. You're all right, Martin. You're genuinely all right. That evening, Dean Martin drove to Tucson General Hospital. Tommy Mitchell was in surgery. His wife, Sarah, was in the waiting area. Terrified, clutching a preliminary bill estimate that would have bankrupted their family for decades. Dean sat down beside her. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm Dean Martin. I was present when your husband was injured. Sarah looked up, her eyes red and swollen. Is he going to be okay? The doctors are doing everything possible, but I need you to understand something. Warner Brothers is paying for everything, every penny. Surgery, rehabilitation, lost wages, everything. You don't need to worry about the financial aspect." Sarah stared at him, not comprehending. "What? How?" "Because what happened to your husband wasn't his fault, and it's not right for your family to suffer for it." Sarah broke down, crying not from fear anymore, but from relief. Dean stayed with her until Tommy emerged from surgery, 3 hours sitting in uncomfortable plastic chairs, drinking terrible coffee, just being present, because nobody else from the production was. Tommy Mitchell survived. The surgery repaired most of the damage to his arm, though he never regained complete mobility. His spine healed and he could walk again, though with a permanent limp. He never performed stunt work again, but Warner Brothers paid his medical bills, all $18,000, and 6 months later hired him as a stunt coordinator, a position where he could use his expertise without risking his body. Rio Bravo resumed production. The following day, Dean Martin was quieter than usual, more contemplative, but he was there. John Wayne observed him differently now, with respect, with something approaching reverence. And the crew, they would have walked through fire for Dean Martin after that. Not because he was famous, but because he'd stood up when it mattered. The studio did attempt retaliation. Dean's next 3 film offers mysteriously evaporated. Projects he was supposedly attached to suddenly went to other actors. The blacklist was real, but Dean Martin had something the studio hadn't anticipated. He had John Wayne's loyalty. He had Howard Hawks telling everyone in Hollywood what actually happened on that set. And he had a crew spreading the word. Within 6 months, the story of what Dean Martin did on the Rio Bravo set had become legend throughout Hollywood. Not in the press, the studios ensured, but among the people who actually made films, the grips, the gaffers, the stunt performers, the extras, Dean Martin became something more than a star. He became a hero. In 1959, the Screen Actors Guild pushed through new insurance requirements for productions. Studios were mandated to carry comprehensive coverage for all performers, including extras and stunt workers. The change was directly influenced by what happened on Rio Bravo. Dean Martin never claimed credit for it, but everyone knew. Tommy Mitchell stayed in touch with Dean for the remainder of Dean's life. Every Christmas, Dean received a card from Tommy, Sarah, and their daughters, and every Christmas, Dean called them. Not for publicity, not for appearances, just because he cared. When Dean Martin died in 1995, Tommy Mitchell attended the funeral. He was 71 by then, walking with a cane, his arm still slightly crooked from that day in the Arizona heat. A reporter asked him what Dean Martin meant to him. Tommy looked at the reporter and said, "Dean Martin saved my life. Not just that day on the set, my entire life. He taught me that you don't have to be powerless just because someone tells you that you are." He demonstrated that standing up for what's right matters more than protecting your job. The reporter pressed him. But he was a major star. It was easier for him to take that risk. Tommy shook his head. "No, it wasn't easy. He risked everything that day, and he did it for me, a person he'd never met, someone who didn't matter to anyone except my family. That's not a celebrity move. That's what a good man does, and Dean Martin was a good man." The story of Rio Bravo is typically told as a classic Western. John Wayne at his peak, Howard Hawks directing masterfully, Dean Martin proving he could act, not just sing. All of that is accurate. But there's another story embedded in that film, a story that didn't appear in press kits or promotional materials, a story about what happens when someone with power decides to use it for something besides personal gain. Dean Martin halted a production on July 23, 1958. He risked his career, his reputation, his future. He confronted a studio executive and refused to back down. And he did it for someone he'd never met, a stunt extra named Tommy Mitchell, who fell wrong and whose life would have been destroyed by medical debt. That's not just an inspiring story. That's a blueprint for being human. That's a reminder that fame and fortune mean nothing if you don't use them to protect people who can't protect themselves. Dean Martin wasn't a crusader. He wasn't a revolutionary. He was just someone who saw something wrong and refused to pretend he didn't see it. Rio Bravo became one of the greatest westerns ever made. But the real heroism on that set happened off-camera in a moment when Dean Martin chose principle over profit, when he chose a stranger's welfare over his own career, when he stood up and said, "Not on my watch." The crew present that day never forgot. They told their children, their grandchildren. The story spread through Hollywood like wildfire, not in newspapers or on television, but in the places where real people worked, where being decent mattered more than being famous. Dean Martin made countless films. He sang countless songs. He made millions of people laugh and cry and feel something. But on July 23, 1958, in the brutal Arizona heat, on a era set that nearly killed a man, Dean Martin did something more important than entertain anyone. He stood up, he spoke up, and he refused to let the machine grind up another human being. That's the Dean Martin story that deserves to be told. Not the cool guy with the martini glass, not the Rat Pack singer with effortless charm, the man who stopped a movie set and said, "Fix this, or I'm gone." The man who risked everything for a stranger, because that's not just courage, that's character.